They found him curled beside the baby's crib, fur matted with rain and mud, breathing shallowly as if each inhale was a small act of defiance against the world. Outside, the storm had not yet relented, hammering against the roof in a rhythm that mirrored my own heartbeat, uneven, urgent, and hollow. His eyes were half-lidded, distant, yet when they flickered toward the tiny figure under the thin, fraying blanket, there was recognition. Not of me, not of the house, but of something far older, far more primal duty. I remember the first time I saw him like this. It was early morning, the fog still thick over the empty streets, a city washed clean in grey water and the scent of wet asphalt. I had been walking past the hospital parking lot, the kind where broken cars and leftover fast food wrappers seem to gather, when a shadow shifted in the mist. A dog, large German shepherd. His coat was dark, streaked with rain and dirt, his ribs showing like a map of every mile he'd ever run. He looked at me, and for a moment I thought he would vanish into the fog, dissolve into the silence, but he stayed. That morning I didn't know his name. I didn't know anything about him. All I knew was that he trembled, as if carrying something far heavier than hunger or cold. And then, almost as if guided by some invisible tether, he followed me slowly, deliberate steps that never drew attention, never demanded it, never begged for it. He simply walked beside me, the weight of his presence pressing against the air until we came to the hospital room where my nephew lay sleeping. The baby's breathing was uneven, a tiny chest rising and falling beneath the thin blanket, oblivious to the storm outside, oblivious to the mud and rain that marked the dog's fur. Yet when the shepherd lowered himself to the floor beside the crib, he did not breathe loudly or whine or scratch for attention. He simply lay down, head resting near the baby's tiny hand, and I saw it then, the slow exhale of something broken and the first tremor of hope. I had been haunted by losses I could never quite name, nights filled with quiet regret, mornings steeped in the memory of mistakes I could not undo. But in that moment, watching him settle beside the crib, I felt a strange, almost sacred stillness settle over the room. The storm raged outside, and inside a different storm began to quiet. The shepherd's eyes met the baby's, and though neither spoke, neither moved, there was a conversation in the pause between heartbeats. A pact unspoken and unbreakable. My own hands hovered over the edge of the crib, trembling, caught between reaching for him and letting the scene remain untouched, sacred in its fragile perfection. I realized then that this story, this journey I had stumbled into, would break me before it healed me. And yet I could not turn away. Not from the dog, not from the baby, not from whatever force had driven them together in that silent, storm-washed room. Like, share, and tell us where in the world you are watching from today? The rain had softened into a drizzle by the time I dared to step closer to him, to study the shepherd as he rested beside the crib. His head was slightly lifted, ears twitching at every distant sound, the hum of fluorescent lights, the soft whine of a ventilator down the hall, the faint echo of footsteps from nurses in the corridor. He was alert but not anxious, aware but not fearful. I could feel the rhythm of his body, tight muscles beneath wet fur, a subtle tremor that suggested exhaustion, and something deeper in a history I could not yet read. I had no idea where he had come from or what had led him to this place. The first clues were small, easily missed by the faint smell of smoke clinging to his coat, a scar across his left shoulder, the way his paws bore traces of mud and gravel from roads less traveled. Each detail told a story, one I could not yet piece together. I knelt slowly on the floor, careful not to startle him, and reached out my hand. His eyes did not waver. He did not flinch. He simply acknowledged my presence, as if granting permission to see but not yet to understand. It was in that quiet moment, listening to the subtle rise and fall of his chest, that memories began to stir in me. Memories I had not wanted to revisit, nights spent walking the city streets alone, searching for something I could not name, watching shadows stretch longer than they should, hearing the cries of animals abandoned in alleys or parks, and knowing I could not save them all. He was one of those souls, I realized. One of those lost beings who carried more than just the weight of hunger or cold. He carried a past fractured and jagged that had left him wary yet unbroken. I remembered the morning the neighbor had called me, voice trembling as she described the fire that had taken their house. He didn't make it, she had said, tears spilling over the phone. Everyone's gone, but the dog. We couldn't find him anywhere. I hadn't known at the time that she meant the German shepherd, that somehow he had survived the flames, carried by sheer instinct or stubbornness, or perhaps by something I could not comprehend. By the time I had arrived at the charred remains of the house, there was only ash and silence. No footprints in the wet soil, no trace of him, just the lingering smell of smoke and the faint echo of life that had once filled the rooms. And yet here he was, months later, in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, drawn inexplicably to a newborn child. The connection between them defied logic and reason. I watched as the baby shifted slightly in sleep, arms stretching toward the shepherd without understanding why, and the dog responded in kind, nose brushing the tiny fingers with the gentlest of touches. It was a slow, deliberate acknowledgement, a recognition of mutual need, of quiet understanding. I began to notice more details as the morning light filtered weakly through the blinds. His fur, darkened by wetness, was marred by scars and tiny abrasions, each one a testament to battles fought silently, to nights spent surviving when no one cared to notice. His eyes, a deep amber flecked with gold, were haunted by memories he could not speak of. And yet there was softness there too, a hint of longing, a willingness to trust carefully, cautiously, with the faintest tremor of hope. I stayed with him for hours, letting my presence become part of the room, part of the slow unfolding of trust. Every now and then the baby would murmur in sleep, a small sound that made the dog's ears flick, tail twitch slightly. I could see it in the way he shifted, adjusting his body to shield the crib, his nose occasionally brushing the blanket as if ensuring the child's warmth and safety. It was instinct, yes, but it was also something else, something unspoken, a silent vow that he would not allow harm to come to this tiny life. At one point I reached for his collar, finding it worn and cracked, the metal tag almost illegible. I could make out a fragment of a name, H. Arrow, or perhaps Heron. The letters were faded, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and neglect. It was a small breadcrumb of the past, a tether to a life I could only imagine, a family perhaps, or a home that had been lost. I felt a pang of sorrow, imagining the world that had let him down, imagining the hands that should have cared for him but had failed. Hours passed like this, slow and deliberate. I did not speak. He did not move from his post beside the crib. It was as if time itself had slowed, allowing us both to inhabit a space of quiet reflection and unspoken empathy. I thought about the streets he must have roamed, the nights he must have endured, the hunger and fear he must have known, and yet here he remained, steadfast and silent, offering protection without demand, comfort without expectation. As the morning light strengthened, I noticed another detail, a faint scent of something sweet and familiar clinging to him, beneath the mud and smoke and rain. It reminded me of early spring mornings, of freshly cut grass and the faint aroma of flowers in bloom. It was a ghost of home, I thought, a hint that somewhere beyond the storm, there had been safety and care. Perhaps he carried that memory still, buried deep, guiding him to this moment, to this room, to this baby. By noon I had begun to accept that the shepherd's story would not be revealed all at once. It would emerge slowly, in pieces, in moments like this, in the way he nuzzled the blanket, in the way he shifted to block drafts from the window, in the subtle rhythms of his breathing when the baby murmured in sleep. Each detail was a fragment of a past I could not yet see fully, but one that demanded acknowledgement, respect and patience. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my chest that he had survived not just by instinct, but by resilience and quiet courage. And I knew that this connection, this improbable bond between a fractured dog and a fragile child, would shape the days to come, carving a path through grief, fear, and uncertainty. Slowly, deliberately, it would unfold. The drizzle outside had stopped entirely by late afternoon. Light filtered through the blinds, soft and muted, painting the floor in stripes of gold and grey. The shepherd shifted again, eyes meeting mine briefly, almost as if asking permission to rest while remaining vigilant. I nodded silently. Permission granted, trust earned. At that moment, I understood that our stories and mine were converging. A life broken by fire and neglect, and a life fragile yet unknowing, both searching for something they could not yet name. And in this quiet room, in the stillness between storms, that search had found a beginning. The afternoon stretched lazily into evening. The hospital corridor outside our room now quiet, save for the soft hum of machinery and distant footsteps fading into the distance. The shepherd had not moved from his position beside the crib, though his body shifted occasionally, adjusting for comfort while maintaining an unbroken vigil over the baby. Every subtle motion spoke of the history of nights spent on cold concrete, of streets that had tested his resolve, of moments when survival had demanded vigilance without pause. Each scar, each patch of fur rubbed raw became a word in a story I had yet to fully decipher. I sank onto the floor beside him, my back leaning against the wall, careful not to intrude, but unable to resist the pull of curiosity and concern. The rain had ceased entirely now, leaving the world outside washed clean, yet the scent of damp earth and asphalt lingered faintly in the air, clinging to him like a whisper of his travels. I traced my gaze over his frame, noticing subtle details I hadn't seen before. A slight limp in his right hind leg, the faint shimmer of old burns along his flank, the way his tail twitched at irregular intervals. Each sign told me that the life he had endured was one I could barely imagine, but also that he had endured it with a quiet dignity I had long forgotten existed in the world. As the room grew darker, shadows stretching long across the floor, I allowed myself to think of the first stories that had reached me about him. A neighbor's hushed voice over the phone, trembling as she recounted the fire that had stolen everything from the house he once called home. The details were fragmentary flames that rose too quickly, smoke that swallowed the room's whole, the chaos of evacuation and screams that had scattered the family to the winds. He had survived, that much I knew. The rest was speculation, pieced together from stray observations and fleeting glimpses of a dog who moved with the care of someone carrying a lifetime of memories. He shifted slightly at the sound of a distant cough, ears lifting, nose twitching. I saw the flicker of tension in his eyes, the way his body tensed minutely, ready to respond to threats I could not yet see. It was a posture I recognized, not one of aggression, but of readiness, of survival honed through countless nights and long, lonely roads. And yet, beneath that guarded exterior, there was an unmistakable softness that had emerged only since arriving here. The baby's presence had softened him, coaxed him into a quiet form of trust, a slow unraveling of the walls built over years of hardship. I thought about the baby then, curled under the thin blanket, the small rise and fall of their chest steadying as sleep deepened. There was no awareness, of course, of the life that had preceded this moment, no comprehension of the shepherd's journey or the silent promise he had made to guard them. Yet instinctively, the child reached with tiny hands toward him in moments of shifting sleep, fingertips brushing the fur with tentative curiosity. Each touch was met with gentle acknowledgement, a nuzzle of the nose, a subtle exhale, a tilt of the head that said, without words, "I am here, and I will not let harm come to you." I recalled nights from my own past, nights spent wandering streets with dogs who had nowhere else to go, dogs whose eyes carried sorrow too heavy to bear. I had learned then that these creatures remember everything, the kindness that arrives too late, the cruelty inflicted without reason, the quiet moments of connection that arrive without expectation. The shepherd before me was no different. He carried memory like a second skin. Yet here in this room he had begun to soften it, allowing fragments of trust to seep through the cracks. My attention was drawn again to the scar along his shoulder, a shallow line etched deep enough to mark his past, but not so severe as to inhibit his strength. I imagined the event that had caused it, a misstep into a fire, perhaps, or a confrontation with someone who did not understand his worth. Every detail of his body was testimony to the burns, the limping paw, the faint smell of smoke that lingered despite baths and brushes. These marks told a story of endurance, of nights spent surviving the unspeakable, and of a heart that had not hardened completely despite it all. The hospital staff had noticed him too, though none approached directly. A nurse had paused once, eyebrows furrowed, whispering to herself about the lost dog that appeared out of nowhere, a brown-haired boy in scrubs trailing behind. She had not intervened yet. They could sense, I think, that he was not a threat, that his presence was protective rather than predatory, and that he carried within him a history they could not begin to understand. He had claimed the room quietly, unobtrusively, like a guardian who had been summoned by fate. By evening, I had begun to trace patterns in his behavior, the way he moved his ears toward distant sounds, The subtle alignment of his body to shield drafts from the crib, the gentle, deliberate shifting whenever the baby stirred. Each motion was instinctual but also deliberate, as if he carried a memory of responsibility that he had not yet been allowed to fulfill. And I realized, with a weight pressing deep in my chest, that he had come here not by chance, but by something older than circumstance, something that bound him to the fragility and innocence he now protected. In the dim light, I noticed the faint glimmer of a tag on his collar, worn and bent, the letters almost indecipherable. I could make out fragments of words, perhaps a name or address, faded to the point of ambiguity. Yet even in that blur, there was significant proof that he had once belonged somewhere, proof that his journey had a beginning, and that this encounter with the baby was part of a larger, incomplete story. I felt a pang of sorrow imagining the hands that had once held him, the voices that had perhaps spoken his name with love, and the lives that had, somehow, let him slip into solitude. Night fell slowly, wrapping the room in muted shadows. The baby slept deeply, chest rising and falling in soft, rhythmic breaths. The shepherd remained at his post, eyes occasionally glinting with quiet vigilance, nose brushing the blanket in small, instinctual gestures. I felt the tension in my own shoulders ease slightly, though my mind remained restless, tracing the strands of his past and the invisible threads that had brought him here. I thought about how the city outside would sleep through another stormless night, how the streets he had once roamed would lie empty, silent witnesses to a life that had been harsh and unforgiving. And here in this small contained room, the past and present converged, the fractured memory of a dog who had endured everything, and the fragile hope of a child whose trust had been given freely, unconsciously yet completely. I leaned my head against the wall, letting the quiet of the room envelop me. Outside, the world continued in muted tones, but inside a different rhythm had taken hold. It was slow, deliberate, weighted with past sorrows but infused with tentative hope. Every heartbeat of the baby, every subtle movement of the shepherd, became a punctuation in a story that demanded patience, empathy, and time. And I knew, as I watched them together in the gathering shadows of night, that the journey ahead would reveal itself slowly, in fragments and whispers, never in leaps or sudden revelations. Each scar, each movement, each touch of trust was part of a story still being written, a story of survival, of protection, of quiet redemption, waiting just beyond the reach of understanding. The night passed quietly, the hospital corridors emptying into silence, leaving only the soft hum of machines and the occasional distant footsteps of nurses on the other side of the hall. I stayed close to the shepherd, kneeling on the floor beside him, watching the faint rise and fall of his chest as the baby slept. Outside, the city had long since fallen asleep, the streets slick with remnants of rain. But inside this small room, a different kind of rhythm persisted, one of trust, caution, and the fragile beginnings of connection. As the first pale light of morning crept through the blinds, I noticed how subtly the baby shifted in sleep, curling instinctively toward the shepherd. The dog responded in kind, adjusting his position, nudging the blanket with his nose, ensuring the tiny body beneath it remained warm. It was remarkable, the way he seemed to understand without comprehension, the way instinct and experience merged into something almost sacred. I could feel my own chest tighten, the mixture of awe and sorrow settling deep, heavy, familiar. I began to observe him more closely, noticing the small, deliberate gestures that had gone unnoticed before. The gentle exhalation when the baby stirred, the slight tilt of his head as though listening for danger that did not exist, the soft pad of a paw moving closer to shield the crib from a draft that I had not even felt. Each motion was precise, controlled, and yet tender, a paradox that spoke volumes about the life he had endured and the loyalty that had been forged from it. The room itself seemed to contract around us, drawing attention to the intimate tableau unfolding there. The sterile walls and muted fluorescent lights faded into irrelevance. Replaced by the sensory details that defined the shepherd's presence, the faint smell of rain-damp fur, the soft brush of his tail against the floor, the subtle warmth radiating from his body that seemed to reach out to the baby. I realized then that this was more than protection. It was an offering, a silent covenant between two beings who had been touched by hardship and loss in ways no one else could understand. I thought about the days and weeks that had likely preceded this moment, nights spent alone, scavenging for food, evading dangers both seen and unseen, and carrying a body and spirit weighed down by scars and memory. The city streets must have been unkind, littered with obstacles and neglect. And yet he had not merely survived, but endured in a way that preserved his capacity for care. That resilience, quiet and unyielding, had brought him here, to this small room, to this fragile life that required his attention, and in turn offered him a reason to rest his weary heart. The baby stirred again, murmuring softly, and the shepherd responded instantly, head lowering to brush the tiny fingers with a gentle nuzzle. I felt a lump rise in my throat, the weight of emotion pressing heavily as I watched the two of them interact. It was not affection in the human sense, nor was it merely an instinctual response. It was recognition, a mutual acknowledgement of need and trust, silent yet absolute. In that moment, I understood that whatever past he carried, whatever wounds had been inflicted upon him, they were tempered here by a connection that neither time nor circumstance could sever. I traced my eyes over the subtle marks of his past once more. The faint scar along his shoulder, still tender to the touch, suggested encounters with fire or sharp metal, though the specifics were lost to memory. His hind leg bore a slight limp, evidence of an injury that had healed imperfectly, but did not hinder his movement now. Each imperfection told a story, yet none of them diminished the integrity of his presence in the room. Rather, they enhanced it, speaking to the endurance required to arrive at this precise suspended moment. By mid-morning, I began to notice a pattern in his attention. Whenever the baby shifted in sleep, his eyes would follow, ears flicking toward even the softest sound. If a shadow moved across the room, his posture changed imperceptibly, alert yet unaggressive. It was as if every muscle, every sinew was poised to respond to threats the child could not perceive, though none were present. The vigilance was both protective and reverent, an acknowledgement that his duty extended beyond mere survival. It was now entwined with the life of another being, small, fragile, and entirely dependent. I found myself drawn to the moments in between the movements, the subtle silence that carried as much meaning as the action itself. The quiet breathing of the baby, the soft rustle of blankets, the slight exhalation of the shepherd's body adjusting to maintain proximity and warmth. It was a rhythm that demanded observation, patience, and reverence. I realized with a bittersweet ache that this was the first time in months I had witnessed such careful, unspoken connection. The kind that could only exist between beings who had known loss and hardship intimately, and who had, through it, learned the quiet language of care. The shepherd's eyes met mine occasionally, not with suspicion, but with a guarded acceptance. There was understanding there, a tacit recognition of my presence as part of the environment, not an intrusion upon it. And as the morning light strengthened, casting muted stripes across the floor, I began to sense the faint trace of something else, memory, perhaps, or intuition. He had been here before in similar circumstances, guided by unseen forces or habits, learned in the long, arduous journey of survival. Every movement, every careful adjustment was deliberate, the echo of experience etched into muscle and sinew. By late morning, the room had settled into a quiet cadence. The baby's breathing remained steady, the shepherd's body aligned protectively alongside, and I found myself leaning back against the wall, absorbed in the tableau, reflecting on the lives that had intersected to create this fragile moment. I could not yet know the details of his past, the streets he had roamed, the fires he had survived, the loneliness he had endured. But I felt the weight of it all, a tangible presence in the air, and understood that his past had shaped not only his vigilance but also his capacity for tenderness. I allowed myself a moment to imagine what he had known, what had brought him here, perhaps a home lost to flames, perhaps the quiet neglect of those who could not see his worth, perhaps nights spent alone beneath the indifferent stars. And yet, in the presence of this small child, all of that seemed to soften, not vanish, but transform into a quiet, resolute dedication. He was no longer simply a survivor. He had become a guardian, a silent witness to innocence. And in that I saw the beginning of something profoundly redemptive for him, for the child, and, in a strange, quiet way, for myself. As the afternoon light began to shift, filtering in warmer tones through the blinds, I noticed the faint glimmer of his collar once more. The letters remained indistinct, faded by time and circumstance, yet they suggested a history, a life that had existed before this moment. I thought about the hands that might have once held him, the voices that had called his name, and the experiences that had shaped the dog who now lay vigilantly beside my nephew. Every detail was a thread, weaving together the past and present into a tapestry I was only beginning to understand. The shepherd shifted again, a gentle nudge toward the blanket, and the baby responded instinctively, curling closer in sleep. I allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time since discovering them together. This quiet moment, delicate, fragile, and unspoken, was a beginning, a slow unfolding that demanded patience and reverence. And as I sat there, watching the interplay of instinct, memory, and trust, I realized that the story we were living was far from over. Its chapters would unfold slowly, deliberately, each movement, each glance, each breath carrying significance that would reveal itself only in time. By mid-morning, the room had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred. The baby slept with gentle murmurs, fingers twitching occasionally against the soft blanket, while the shepherd remained perfectly aligned beside the crib, his body a protective barrier shaped by instinct and experience. There was a stillness that went beyond mere absence of movement, a quiet presence that seemed to resonate through the room, binding us together in a fragile web of trust and attention. I had moved closer, keeping a careful distance but unable to resist the urge to observe him as he monitored the child. Every movement he made was deliberate. A subtle shift of weight to block a draft, a careful nudge of the blanket with his nose. The way his ears flicked toward distant sounds I could barely hear, all spoke of a history shaped by vigilance and hardship. Each scar on his coat, each limping step, each patch of fur matted by previous storms, became a chapter in a story I was only beginning to piece together. I thought about how he must have wandered the streets before arriving here, navigating alleys, avoiding dangers that were invisible to those who never paid attention. His body carried memory like a map, every scar, every limp, every twitch of muscle a testament to nights endured in hunger, fear, and solitude. Yet despite the weight of experience, there was a softness emerging now, a willingness to allow trust to take root, sparked by the fragile presence of a human infant. The baby stirred, tiny hands reaching outward in an instinctive gesture of curiosity. The shepherd responded immediately, lowering his head, brushing his nose gently against the infant's palm, and then resting his chin on the edge of the crib. It was a simple gesture, yet one of immense significance, a recognition of the child's vulnerability, and simultaneously a declaration of his own dedication. Watching them, I felt a quiet shift inside myself, an awakening to the possibility that connection, even in the midst of brokenness, could be gentle, unwavering, and redemptive. Hours passed like this, slow and deliberate. I could see him studying the baby, tilting his head, eyes softening in ways that suggested understanding beyond words. Occasionally he would lift a paw slightly, testing the limits of proximity, before withdrawing carefully. There was patience in his movements, a careful negotiation of trust that had likely been shaped over months, perhaps years, of learning to survive without relying on anyone. And now, in the presence of this small, fragile life, he was learning something new, the quiet art of protection without fear, of care without expectation, of loyalty that was unspoken but absolute. I couldn't help but wonder about the life he had left behind. The worn collar, faint letters barely legible in the dim light, suggested a home once claimed but now lost. Perhaps a family, perhaps someone who had cared but was no longer there. The details remained elusive, but the essence of loss was clear. He had known abandonment, pain, and neglect, yet none of it had hardened him to the point of coldness. There was resilience in his gaze, tempered by patience and a quiet wisdom that only suffering can forge. I moved closer still, keeping my voice to a whisper, speaking to him in tones I hoped would convey calm rather than intrusion. "It's okay," I murmured. "You're safe here." He didn't move in response, yet his eyes followed me, flicking briefly with cautious acknowledgement. It was subtle, but it was there, the faintest acknowledgement of human presence, a hint that he was beginning to understand that the environment surrounding the child was a safe one, even if the world beyond the walls had been cruel and unrelenting. The baby stirred again, eyelids fluttering, and the shepherd nudged closer, resting his muzzle atop the blanket with a deliberate gentleness that made my throat tighten. There was a rhythm to their interaction, a give and take of energy and attention that did not rely on words. The dog's actions were deliberate yet unforced, instinctual yet infused with something deeper, a recognition that this tiny being depended entirely on him, and a willingness to honor that dependency fully. I recalled stories of dogs who had survived trauma and found purpose only later, when presented with a life that demanded their loyalty and care. Perhaps that was what was unfolding here. He had endured loss and hardship, had wandered streets and alleys and endured nights of fear and hunger, and now he had found a reason to anchor himself, a life to protect, a connection that transcended the boundaries of instinct. The baby, for its part, seemed to sense this silently, responding with tiny movements, soft sighs, and the occasional stretch of a hand that sought contact, recognition, and reassurance. By early afternoon, the light had shifted to a warm, muted glow, filtering through the blinds in soft golden stripes. I observed the dog's movements more closely, noticing how he subtly adjusted his body to shield the crib from a faint draft, how his tail remained still, yet tense, ready to respond to any disturbance. Every gesture was careful, precise, and imbued with intention. It was as if he were silently rehearsing the roles he had been deprived of for so long: protector, companion, guardian, and finding fulfillment in the quiet execution of each one. I could feel the tension in my own shoulders begin to ease, replaced by a quiet reverence for the tableau before me. The shepherd and the baby were teaching each other, in the slowest, most deliberate of ways, about trust, about the possibility of connection, about the fragile beauty of life when it is honored and protected. And in watching them, I felt my own sense of brokenness begin to soften, just slightly, as though the quiet, unspoken bond between the two of them could extend, if only in part, to me. Even as the room settled into this delicate rhythm, I remained acutely aware of the fragments of the shepherd's past that lingered at the edges of perception. The scars, the limp, the faint smell of smoke, the worn collar are all reminders of a life that had not been easy, a history that could not be ignored. Yet here, beside the crib, all of that history seemed to converge into a singular purpose. He was no longer defined solely by the hardships he had endured. He was defined by the trust he was cultivating, by the quiet acts of protection and care that revealed a depth of character forged in adversity, but tempered by the possibility of redemption. The baby stirred once more, and the shepherd responded immediately, nudging the blanket, adjusting his position, ensuring warmth and security. I allowed myself to exhale fully, the tension I had carried for days loosening in response to this fragile yet profound connection. In this small, quiet room, with the rain now fully departed and light softening the edges of shadows, something new had begun to emerge, a bond that transcended fear, a trust that could heal, and a silent promise that this small life would be guarded, nurtured and loved, no matter the hardships that lay ahead. By late afternoon, the room had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sacred, punctuated only by the subtle sounds of the baby shifting in sleep, the gentle exhalation of the shepherd's breath, and the occasional distant hum of activity in the hospital corridor. It was in these hours that I began to notice something extraordinary, a transformation, subtle yet profound, in the way the dog moved, observed, and interacted with the world around him. At first, it was imperceptible, a slight tilt of the head as he followed the baby's restless movements, the faint brush of his paw against the edge of the crib, a careful shift of weight to block a draft I hadn't yet sensed. These gestures could have been dismissed as instinct, yet there was an intentionality to them that felt deliberate, conscious, and deeply rooted in a sense of duty that had been refined over a lifetime of hardship. It was as though he were learning something new about himself, about the depth of care he was capable of, about the quiet power of presence, about the ability to nurture rather than merely survive. I watched him closely, heart tight with both admiration and sorrow. His eyes, those deep amber pools flecked with gold, were no longer haunted solely by past traumas. There was a glimmer of understanding now, a recognition that his vigilance was not just about guarding against the world, but about actively protecting a life that depended on him. Every subtle movement, a careful exhale, a shift in posture, the gentle nudge of the blanket with his nose spoke of growing awareness and intent. He was learning slowly and silently the language of trust and care that the baby seemed to intuitively understand. The child, for its part, responded in kind, Fingers stretched out in the muted rhythms of sleep, brushing the dog's fur with the smallest pressure, eliciting soft, almost imperceptible responses. The shepherd adapted to each motion, his body molding around the crib, a living shield shaped by experience and emerging empathy. There was a quiet dialogue happening in the spaces between movement and breath, one that required no words, no recognition beyond the subtle acknowledgement of presence. And in that dialogue, I could see the beginnings of a bond that transcended instinct, a connection that spoke to loyalty, protection, and the slow healing of both human and canine souls. I found myself tracing the lines of his body, noting the scars along his flank, the slight limp in his right hind leg, the faded letters on his worn collar. Each mark told a story, a history of survival and endurance that had forged his capacity for care. Yet now, in the presence of the baby, those marks seemed less like reminders of past pain and more like testaments to resilience, proof that he had endured long enough, wandered far enough, and waited patiently enough to arrive at this moment of quiet significance. The day stretched on in the filtered light of late afternoon, and I noticed him beginning to engage with me in subtle ways I had not seen before. A glance in my direction, brief and measured, suggested acknowledgement of my presence without intrusion. A small nudge of his paw toward the crib seemed to indicate an invitation, a silent question of trust. Could I step back and allow him the space to act as guardian without interference? It was a delicate negotiation, one that required patience and respect, and I found myself yielding instinctively, moved by the quiet authority of a being who had endured far more than I could ever imagine. There were moments when he would shift, not in response to the baby, but as though sensing my emotions, my hesitation, my silent questioning of whether I could allow him to remain here, to continue in this role without human oversight. Each time he responded with calm deliberation, a gentle exhalation, a slight lowering of his head that seemed to reassure me I am capable. I am here, I understand. I began to recognize a subtle transformation in myself as well. Observing him, witnessing his quiet devotion and the deliberate care with which he navigated this fragile relationship, I felt my own anxieties and grief begin to soften. The brokenness I had carried for years, the guilt, the sorrow, the sense of helplessness in the face of suffering began to find relief in this room, in the measured presence of a dog who had known hardship and yet could still extend trust and protection. By evening, the rhythm of the room had shifted from tentative to established. The baby slept more soundly, comforted by the shepherd's unwavering proximity. The dog's movements were less reactive and more deliberate, shaped by emerging patterns of care rather than mere instinctual response. He had become quietly and irrevocably a protector, a guardian, and a companion. It was a silent transformation, imperceptible to anyone who did not pause to observe, yet monumental in its implications. The soft glow of the hospital lights cast long shadows across the floor, highlighting the contours of his body as he rested with measured vigilance. I could see the tension in his muscles ease slightly, the lines of stress that had been etched by a lifetime of survival softening as he acclimated to this role. Each breath was slower, deeper, more deliberate. Each movement carried intention, a promise of continued protection and unwavering presence. I thought about the nights he must have endured alone, the streets roamed in search of food or safety, the dangers that had tested him continuously. And yet, despite all of that, he had learned to adapt, to trust, and to extend his care beyond himself. In the presence of this child, he was no longer merely surviving. He was thriving in a way that was quietly transformative, not only for him but for everyone who witnessed it. By late evening, the hospital room had grown quiet, the distant corridors nearly empty. I remained on the floor, observing, reflecting, and quietly acknowledging the subtle changes unfolding before me. The shepherd had become more than a survivor. He had become a participant in a delicate dance of trust and care, a living testament to resilience, patience, and the redemptive power of connection. As the night settled in, I leaned back against the wall, letting the weight of the day press gently against me. Outside, the city slept under a blanket of muted light, oblivious to the quiet transformations occurring within the walls of this small room. But inside, the air was alive with meaning, charged with the invisible threads of trust, protection, and mutual recognition. The shepherd and the baby had begun a silent conversation, one that would unfold slowly, deliberately, shaping the contours of their shared lives in ways that neither time nor circumstance could fully predict. I realized then that this transformation, subtle and ongoing, was not merely the product of instinct or chance. It was a convergence of history, resilience, and the quiet guidance of circumstance, a moment in which a dog who had known hardship could extend care, and a child who was fragile could receive it. And in that, I found a sense of hope I had not allowed myself to feel in years, that even in the shadow of loss, even amid the scars of the past, the capacity for connection, loyalty, and redemption remained alive, waiting to be discovered. Night had fully descended over the hospital, and the corridors were hushed, echoing only with the distant hum of machinery and the soft tread of a lone nurse making her rounds. Inside the room, the shepherd remained as he had for hours still, poised and unwavering beside the crib. There was a weight to his presence now, a gravity that had grown subtly over the course of the day. It was no longer just survival or instinct. It was a conscious, deliberate vigilance that seemed to radiate through the space, touching everything in its periphery, shaping the rhythm of the room itself. The baby slept peacefully, chest rising and falling in gentle waves, fingers curling slightly around the edge of the blanket. Occasionally the little hand would twitch, brushing against the fur of the shepherd, and each time he responded with the lightest nudge of his nose or a careful repositioning to maintain warmth and protection. It was a language without words, but one rich with meaning, resonant with trust and dense with understanding. I had watched many animals, many moments of connection, but nothing unfolded with such quiet intensity. The patience, the deliberation, the absolute focus on the fragile life before him. I knelt on the floor, tracing the line of the dog's body in soft light, my fingers hovering without touching, hesitant out of respect. The scars along his flank told a story, one etched not just in flesh but in memory. A faint limp in his right hind leg suggested past injury. The fraying edges of his coat hinted at nights spent in rain and mud. And yet these were not signs of weakness. They were markers of endurance, badges of experience that lent weight to the quiet authority he now carried. Each scar, each imperfection spoke of resilience and now purpose. As I watched, I began to notice the subtleties in his demeanor that had not been present before. The soft exhale that seemed to mirror the baby's breathing. The slight shift in posture whenever the child moved. The careful positioning of his body to create a protective barrier. These were not random or reflexive actions. They were conscious, deliberate, and indicative of a growing understanding. He was no longer merely observing, no longer merely present. He had assumed responsibility. And in doing so, he had begun a slow, silent transformation, the depth of which was impossible to measure but unmistakable in its impact. There was a stillness to the room, broken only by the occasional stir of the baby or the subtle shuffle of the shepherd's paws across the floor. Outside, the city slept beneath a blanket of muted streetlights and lingering fog, oblivious to the intimate vigil unfolding within these walls. And yet, within this small enclosed space, there existed a universe in microcosm, one in which trust, protection, and patience intertwined to form a bond that was fragile, tentative, yet profoundly real. I found myself reflecting on his past, trying to piece together the fragments of a story hinted at in the scars, the limp, the worn collar, and the faint traces of smoke lingering in his fur. Perhaps there had been a fire, a house lost, a family displaced. Perhaps nights spent in alleys, streets, or shelters had taught him caution, vigilance, and endurance. And yet, none of these hardships had hardened him beyond the capacity to care. On the contrary, they had refined him, honed him into a guardian capable of empathy and fidelity, in a way that was almost sacred. The baby shifted again, murmuring softly, eyes fluttering beneath lids heavy with sleep. The shepherd responded instantly, adjusting his body, nudging the blanket with a gentle touch, ensuring warmth and comfort. I watched, heart constricting and expanding at once, the scene unfolding with a deliberate, almost painful beauty. It was in these moments, subtle, understated, and entirely silent, that the enormity of what had begun to happen became clear. This was not merely a dog and a child occupying the same room. This was the emergence of a profound emotional covenant, shaped by shared vulnerability, quiet devotion, and instinct, transformed into conscious care. I allowed myself to sit back against the wall, absorbing the stillness and observing the ebb and flow of interaction. The dog's amber eyes met mine briefly, a subtle acknowledgement that felt like a gentle invitation, a recognition that he understood my presence but did not require my interference. I felt the weight of trust in that gaze, the unspoken dialogue that conveyed a depth of understanding I could neither name nor fully grasp. And in that moment, I recognized a shift in myself as well as softening of the rigid caution I had carried for years, a willingness to yield space and respect to a being whose patience and vigilance had earned it. The hours stretched on, slow and deliberate, each one marked by minor shifts in posture, slight gestures of care, and quiet, continuous observation. I began to notice other signs of his adaptation, the way he would occasionally glance toward the door, assessing potential threats with measured attention, the subtle adjustments to his own body, ensuring that no part of the crib remained exposed. The calm, rhythmic breathing that mirrored the baby's own, forming a shared cadence that spoke to unspoken understanding and emerging harmony. There was a weight to the silence as well, a presence that demanded acknowledgement. It was not merely the absence of sound, but the active creation of a space in which vigilance and trust could coexist. The shepherd seemed to inhabit this space fully, a living guardian of both body and spirit, ensuring that the fragile life under the blanket remained undisturbed, safe, and entirely protected. I thought about the implications of this transformation, the subtle ways in which trauma and endurance could be converted into vigilance, patience, and care. He had endured hardship, survived abandonment, and now in the quiet of this hospital room, he had begun to repurpose his resilience toward protection and connection. And in doing so, he had quietly transformed not just his own behavior, but the emotional landscape of the room itself. There was a palpable sense of calm, a depth of presence that spoke to the invisible threads binding us together, threading through scars and sleep and the quiet act of watching over another being. By midnight, the baby's breathing had deepened into a steady rhythm, the soft rise and fall of the chest a lullaby to the attentive shepherd. He remained vigilant, but the tension that had defined his posture earlier in the day had softened into a quiet, controlled ease. It was a subtle shift, but one that spoke volumes, an indication that trust had begun to take root, that the child's presence had begun to heal not just in body, but in spirit, and that the dog's vigilance was now infused with something more profound than instinct, conscious care, empathy, and the quiet bloom of loyalty fully realized. And as I sat there, in the soft glow of the hospital lights, witnessing this silent transformation, I understood that the story unfolding was far from ordinary. It was not simply about survival or protection. It was about endurance converted into trust, trauma transformed into care, and the slow, deliberate emergence of a bond that would shape lives in ways subtle yet irreversible. In that quiet room amid shadows and soft light, the shepherd and the baby had begun a journey together of mutual discovery, healing, and the quiet, inexorable shaping of hearts that had known hardship, but were learning finally to hope. The following morning arrived muted and grey, the sun struggling to pierce through thick clouds that hung low over the city. Rain threatened again, droplets pattering against the hospital windows, a subtle reminder that the outside world remained unpredictable and unkind. Inside, however, the room seemed insulated, cocooned in the quiet bond that had been forming between the shepherd and the baby. Yet beneath the calm, I sensed the subtle stirrings of tension, the kind that arrives not with noise but in the small, almost imperceptible shifts of posture and gaze that signal an approaching challenge. The shepherd had risen slightly earlier than usual, stretching slowly, muscles rippling beneath fur still damp from the lingering humidity of rain. He walked a measured circle around the crib, nose hovering, ears flicking toward the hall as though listening for sounds I could not hear. His vigilance had sharpened overnight. Where before his watchfulness had been gentle, now it bore an intensity that suggested both confidence and a premonition, a quiet awareness that something might require more than instinct alone. The baby stirred beneath the blanket, murmuring softly. Instantly the shepherd lowered his head, nudging the child gently with a controlled, deliberate movement that offered both reassurance and protection. I could see the baby's tiny fingers curl around a strand of fur, unconsciously drawing strength and comfort from the presence beside them. The connection was seamless, almost predestined, the type of bond that grows in silence and is sustained in subtle gestures rather than spoken words. The grey morning pressed against the windows, and with it came the faint, unsettling sounds of the hospital waking. Doors creaked in the distance, wheels rolled along the floors, and hushed conversations leaked through the walls. Normally innocuous, these noises now seemed imbued with tension, as though the shepherd were reading into the world more keenly than I could. He shifted, the tip of his tail brushing the floor with a barely perceptible tremor, and I felt the tightening of muscles that spoke of readiness. It was subtle, almost imperceptible to anyone unobservant, yet charged with purpose. I watched him closely, noting the subtle ways his body language changed in response to these stimuli. The slight flare of nostrils, the barely there lift of one paw, the way his ears pivoted with precision are all signs that the outside world, for all its ordinary appearance, held potential challenges. It was a reminder that the trust we had built, delicate and profound though it was, existed in the context of a world that could be harsh, chaotic, and indifferent. And the shepherd, hardened by experiences I could only imagine, was already anticipating it, adjusting, preparing. Hours passed in this delicate balance, the rhythm of the room punctuated only by the baby's soft breaths and the shepherd's measured movements. Occasionally a nurse would pass the door, pausing for a brief moment to glance in. Their eyes lingered on the dog, noting his stillness, his presence, but none approached. It was as though everyone could sense the invisible threads that had woven this protective bond, and that intrusion was unnecessary, even dangerous. His authority in the room was unspoken yet undeniable, a testament to the quiet confidence earned through endurance and vigilance. By late morning, a subtle tension had begun to manifest, an unspoken reminder that challenges could arise not just from outside forces, but from human decisions as well. Conversations between staff outside the room carried fragments of words I could piece together: concern, procedure, risk. The shepherd's ears twitched, head lifting briefly, eyes narrowing as though processing not only the sounds themselves, but the implications behind them. He had learned to interpret signals beyond simple threats. His understanding now extended to human behavior, patterns and moods, a keen intelligence sharpened by experience. I felt a shiver of apprehension, a realization that despite the quiet sanctuary we had built, the fragility of this bond could be tested. There would be decisions made about the baby, about the hospital, about the dog himself, and not all of them might honor the trust that had taken root here. I sensed the shepherd's awareness of this possibility too, the subtle shift in posture, the tightening of his jaw, the low, almost inaudible exhale that was as much a preparation for intervention as it was a silent promise to the child. The baby stirred again, small eyelids fluttering open, and immediately the shepherd adjusted, resting his chin atop the edge of the crib in a protective gesture that seemed almost ceremonial. It was a silent vow, repeated daily, that no harm would come while he remained by their side. I watched, fascinated and apprehensive, as he followed every movement with unwavering attention, muscles coiled and ready, eyes deep pools of intent and caution. There was an elegance in the way he navigated the tension, a fluidity born of years surviving in environments that demanded constant alertness. I recalled fleeting fragments of his past nights alone on rain-slicked streets, the faint smell of smoke in his fur hinting at flames he had survived, scars along his flank marking encounters with danger I could only imagine. Each memory was invisible yet palpable in the precision and deliberation of his movements. He had endured hardship, abandonment and fear, and now all that experience was focused, distilled into a quiet, unwavering guardianship. It was a transformation that had emerged slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, yet now it defined every breath, every glance, every motion. By afternoon, the sense of potential threat had not vanished. It had simply become part of the fabric of the room. I noticed the way the shepherd occasionally glanced toward the door, ears flicking, muscles tensing, and then relaxing when the source proved innocuous. His patience was deliberate, honed through years of observing, assessing, and waiting. He was learning to calibrate his vigilance, extending it not only to immediate danger, but to the emotional environment around the child. Every shift in mood, every tone of voice, every movement in the periphery of vision was catalogued and interpreted with remarkable subtlety. The baby's hand reached again toward him, curling around the coarse fur along his neck. The shepherd responded with a gentle exhale, his eyes softening as if to acknowledge the trust extended and reaffirm it silently. I felt a lump rise in my throat, the profound weight of the bond settling deep in my chest. Here was a dog who had endured the unendurable, who had survived the unforgiving, now offering absolute, unspoken protection to a life entirely dependent on him. And in doing so, he had transformed not only himself but the atmosphere of the room from one shaped by fear and uncertainty to one infused with tentative trust, quiet courage, and growing hope. As evening fell, the rain outside began again, tapping against the windows in gentle rhythms. The shepherd rested at last, his body aligned perfectly with the crib, eyes vigilant yet calm, exhaling slowly in tandem with the baby's steady breaths. I sat back, watching the tableau, aware that the quiet storm beyond the walls mirrored the subtle tension that had defined our day. Yet inside, despite potential threats, uncertainty, and unspoken challenges, there was a fragile peace earned, deliberate, and held with unwavering attention. And I understood, with a weight pressing gently on my heart, that this was only the beginning. Challenges would come, decisions would need to be made, and the world outside would not pause for the fragile bond that had formed here. But in the quiet vigilance of the shepherd, in the soft trust of the baby, and in the space that existed between them, I recognized a power far greater than fear or uncertainty, a quiet courage, a deliberate devotion, and a slow, patient unfolding of trust that could withstand storms both literal and metaphorical. The morning light filtered through the blinds in muted gold and grey, casting long shadows across the hospital floor. Outside, the city breathed in quiet anticipation, unaware of the delicate equilibrium within this small room. Inside, however, the atmosphere was charged with subtle tension, not violent or overt, but measured, heavy, the kind that weighs on a soul without a sound. I could feel it in the air, thick and almost tangible, pressing gently against the quiet rhythm of the baby's sleep and the shepherd's unwavering vigilance. He had remained at the crib's edge all night, shifting only when necessary, responding to the baby's murmurs with deliberate gentleness. But now, with sunlight softening the corners of the room, there was a change. A decision, unspoken but felt, seemed to hover in the space between us, a choice that would shape not only the immediate hours, but the trajectory of the bond that had formed in silence. The shepherd, whose presence had once been tentative, whose trust had been cautious, now bore the weight of an awareness that went beyond instinct. He understood, in a way that no words could convey, that the moments ahead demanded more than vigilance. They demanded clarity, action, and quiet courage. I watched him closely, noting every subtle adjustment in posture. The faint scar along his flank caught the light, reminding me once again of the history he carried with him, of nights spent alone, of streets traversed in hunger and fear, of dangers faced without witness or aid. And yet in this room that past seemed to converge into a single, unwavering purpose, the protection of this fragile life, the silent guardianship of a being entirely dependent on him. His amber eyes, once haunted by memory, now glimmered with intent, reflecting both caution and resolve. The baby stirred, small lips parting in a soundless sigh, tiny fingers curling around the edge of the blanket. The shepherd responded with practiced gentleness, nudging the child's hand, adjusting the blanket with precise care, and then positioning himself to shield against even the slightest shift in airflow. There was a rhythm to these movements, deliberate yet unforced, instinctual yet guided by a growing understanding of responsibility. Every motion was a testament to the transformation that had unfolded over days of quiet vigilance, patient observation, and slow trust-building. But the weight of choice pressed upon me as well. I had been a passive witness for hours, absorbing the nuances of this bond, learning from their quiet dialogue. Yet now, circumstances demanded awareness of the decisions looming beyond the walls of this room. Conversations filtered through the hall, hinted at interventions, procedures, and administrative decisions that could compromise the fragile trust we had nurtured. I felt my own heart tighten at the realization that protection might not only involve guiding the baby safely through sleep and care, but also navigating a world that did not yet understand the depth of connection between child and dog. The shepherd seemed to sense my concern, though his attention never wavered from the baby. His head lifted slightly, ears flicking toward the distant sounds of the corridor, nostrils flaring with subtle vigilance. There was a weight in the amber depths of his eyes, an almost human gravity that suggested he comprehended the stakes in ways I could only grasp imperfectly. He had endured hardship, loss, and isolation, and now he bore the responsibility of a different kind that demanded discernment, patience, and courage. Hours passed slowly, deliberately. I observed the interplay of light, shadow, and sound in the room, noting how the dog's body language shifted imperceptibly with every stir of the baby, every distant creak of wheels in the hall. It was as though he was calculating, weighing threat and safety, determining the parameters of his guardianship in real time. The scars along his limbs, the limp in his hind leg, and the faded letters on his collar spoke to a history of survival, but it was his intelligence, patience, and empathy that now defined him in this room. He was no longer merely responding to instinct. He was making choices, silent and deliberate, to protect the child he had come to recognize as his responsibility. I too felt the weight of decision pressing upon me. To intervene would risk disturbing the delicate trust that had formed. To remain passive could leave the child vulnerable to unseen forces beyond our control. And yet, watching the shepherd, I realized that he had already committed in ways that transcended words to a role I could neither fully assume nor replicate. My choice then was not to dictate the terms of protection, but to honor them, to step back and trust in the wisdom that had been forged through his lived experience. Mid-afternoon brought with it a subtle shift in light, the golden hues softening to the muted tones of approaching evening. The rain, which had threatened all day, fell lightly against the windows, a gentle percussion that underscored the quiet intensity of the room. The shepherd remained aligned with the crib, eyes attentive, ears twitching, tail still yet poised. Every breath, every movement carried significance. He had become more than a guardian. He was the anchor of this small universe, the silent arbiter of safety, the embodiment of patience and vigilance refined through adversity. The baby's soft murmurs continued, tiny stretches and movements that elicited micro-adjustments from the dog. I watched transfixed as his body shifted to accommodate, protect, and nurture. It was a slow dance, unspoken and unseen by the world beyond the room, yet profound in its intimacy and impact. Each gesture reinforced trust, each breath synchronized with the child's, each small adjustment a reaffirmation of the covenant that had formed silently over days of observation, care, and shared presence. Even as shadows lengthened across the floor, there was no urgency, no rush to action. The gravity of choice had been met with a quiet, measured response. The shepherd's commitment was evident, his presence steady, his vigilance unwavering. He had transformed silently and wholly from a survivor to a protector, from a wary stranger to a dedicated guardian, and in doing so, he had shifted the emotional landscape of the room. What had begun as observation, instinct, and tentative care had become deliberate, conscious guardianship, a testament to the enduring power of patience, empathy, and trust. I felt a deep, aching gratitude for this silent lesson unfolding before me. In the quiet of the hospital room, in the interplay of light and shadow, breath and movement, a story of resilience, transformation, and devotion had taken shape. The shepherd had not only protected the baby physically, he had illuminated the profound, often overlooked capacity for connection that can emerge even in the aftermath of hardship. And as evening settled fully, the room enveloped in soft, muted light, I realized that the choices made today by both human and canine had irrevocably altered the path forward. The baby was safe, nurtured, and watched over with unwavering dedication. The shepherd had stepped fully into his role, silent yet commanding, vigilant yet gentle, aware of the weight of responsibility and accepting it without hesitation. In that quiet, deliberate presence, I felt the seeds of redemption, healing, and trust firmly planted, ready to grow in the days and moments to come. The hospital's corridors were quieter than usual that evening, an almost reverent stillness hanging in the air. The faint hum of machines and the soft shuffle of distant footsteps were the only sounds, each one echoing faintly against the sterile walls. Inside the small room, the atmosphere had settled into a tense tranquility. The shepherd remained beside the crib, his body low, muscles relaxed but ready, a perfect balance of stillness and preparedness. There was a calm about him that was both grounding and almost sacred, a reflection of the bond he had formed with the baby, and the unspoken understanding that this fragile connection required vigilance, patience, and quiet dedication. The baby slept, chest rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to sync with the shepherd's measured breaths. Fingers twitched against the soft blanket, brushing against the dog's fur, and each time he responded with the lightest touch, a nuzzle, a gentle shift, an adjustment that was at once protective and tender. It was a silent communication, the kind of dialogue that requires no words yet conveys everything essential: trust, care, and a recognition of vulnerability. I watched, awed by the depth of connection, aware that each gesture, no matter how small, was steeped in history, experience, and an almost instinctive wisdom. I found myself tracing his movements in quiet observation, noting the subtle fluidity with which he navigated the space. His eyes were alert yet softened, amber pools reflecting not just the immediate room, but the echoes of a past filled with survival and uncertainty. Scars along his flanks told a story of endurance. A slight limp in his hind leg suggested injuries endured and overcame. Yet these marks, rather than diminishing his presence, lent it weight, authority, and the gravitas of experience. He was no longer merely a survivor. He had become an agent of care, a silent protector, and in this room the fulcrum upon which fragile safety balanced. The day had been long, yet the tension from earlier hours had not entirely dissipated. There remained the unspoken awareness of potential challenges beyond the walls. Administrative decisions, hospital procedures, human judgment, all threats to the fragile equilibrium we had painstakingly cultivated. I sensed it in the shepherd's subtle shifts, the almost imperceptible tightening of his muscles, the occasional lift of his head toward the corridor. His vigilance was instinctive, yet honed by a deep understanding of the environment and the needs of the child he had silently adopted as his responsibility. Time stretched slowly, each moment unfolding deliberately, as though the room itself had adopted the rhythm of our combined attention. The baby's small movements were mirrored by the shepherd's adjustments, a choreography of care and protection that was almost imperceptible to anyone who was not paying close attention. Each sigh, each twitch, each gentle shift reinforced the unspoken covenant that had formed a bond forged in patience, trust, and the silent acknowledgement of vulnerability. As the evening deepened, I began to reflect on the shepherd's journey, piecing together the fragments of a past suggested by his scars, the worn collar, and the faint hints of smoke lingering in his fur. I imagined nights spent on rain-slick streets, encounters with dangers unseen, and hours of solitude that had forged his vigilance and endurance. And yet, despite all of this, he had stepped fully into a role of care, allowing himself to be vulnerable enough to nurture and protect a life wholly dependent on him. In that act, he had not only transformed himself, but had also reshaped the emotional landscape of the room, infusing it with quiet hope and the beginnings of redemption. The hospital lights cast long muted shadows across the floor, softening the edges of the room and highlighting the contours of his body. Every gesture, every breath, every subtle shift in posture seemed laden with intention. He was not merely present, he was fully engaged, attuned to the rhythms of the child's breathing, the ambient sounds of the corridor and the shifting light that marked the passing of time. It was a vigilance refined by experience, patience, and an intuitive understanding of responsibility that transcended words. I knelt at a respectful distance, silently acknowledging the weight of the moment. Here was a dog who had endured abandonment, fear, and hardship, now offering unwavering protection to a life that had yet to understand the vastness of the world. And yet in his presence, I felt a mirrored sense of protection and trust being extended to me as well. We were participants in a silent covenant, each recognizing the fragility of life and the importance of care, patience, and vigilance. The baby stirred slightly, murmuring in a soundless whisper, and the shepherd responded immediately, lowering his head to ensure warmth, comfort, and protection. His eyes flicked toward me for a moment, a glance heavy with understanding, a reminder that the bond I was witnessing was not only between dog and child, but a quiet shared responsibility that included me in ways subtle yet profound. It was a lesson in trust, patience, and the endurance of empathy, delivered without words but entirely understood. As night fully enveloped the hospital, the faint sound of rain outside became a steady backdrop, a rhythm that mirrored the quiet intensity of our vigil. The shepherd rested his chin on the edge of the crib, eyes half closed but alert, a living embodiment of calm readiness. The baby's breathing was steady, rhythmic, a gentle assurance that our efforts, patience, and care had preserved safety in its most fragile form. The room itself seemed to exhale, steeped in a serenity that had been hard-won through vigilance, trust, and unspoken devotion. I recognized at that moment that what had unfolded over the past days was extraordinary. It was not simply about survival or instinct, or the immediate safety of a child. It was about the quiet unfolding of redemption, the slow emergence of trust, and the deliberate cultivation of care forged through patience, awareness, and unwavering commitment. The shepherd had transformed from a creature shaped by hardship into a guardian defined by deliberate choice, and in doing so, had reshaped the world around him, softening fear, inspiring hope, and creating a sanctuary of trust and protection that would endure beyond this room. And as I watched him, the soft rise and fall of the baby's chest, the gentle rhythm of his own breathing, the long shadows cast by the muted light, I understood that this was only the beginning of the story. The calm before redemption had arrived, a moment of quiet, reflective peace that hinted at the profound changes still to come for the child. The dog, and for me who had been witness to a bond so deep and deliberate that it defied description, yet could be felt in every heartbeat, every breath, and every subtle gesture of care. The room was heavy with a stillness that felt almost sacred, the soft hum of the hospital machines punctuating the otherwise silent space. Shadows stretched across the floor as the late afternoon sun attempted to pierce the muted light, filtering through rain-streaked windows. The shepherd lay at the crib's edge, head resting lightly on the mattress rail, amber eyes scanning every subtle movement of the baby, every flicker of light, every whisper of sound that crept through the hospital corridor. There was a weight in his vigilance now, not merely instinctive but deliberate and conscious, a testament to all that had come before and the responsibility he had quietly assumed. The baby shifted slightly, a soft sigh escaping tiny lips. The shepherd responded immediately, nudging the small hand with gentle precision, adjusting the blanket, aligning his own body as though forming a protective shield. I watched, silently tracing the arcs of his movements, noticing the subtle choreography of gestures honed through experience, instinct, and an emerging intelligence that seemed to understand far more than the surface of the room. Each movement, no matter how slight, carried the intention that no harm would come, a reassurance that presence alone could deliver safety and calm. Hours had passed in this careful rhythm, the day stretching slowly and deliberately, as if time itself had paused to honor the quiet work unfolding here. I had come to realize that this was no ordinary guardianship. It was a culmination of endurance, patience, and courage, distilled over years of survival. Every scar along the shepherd's body, every limp in his hind leg, every shadow in his amber eyes told a story of hardship. And now each element lent weight and authority to the protection he offered. He had transformed, not through sudden revelation, but through the slow, deliberate forging of character in a world that demanded both strength and subtlety. And yet, beneath the calm surface there remained a tension not of immediate danger, but of impending decisions, human interventions, and the weight of choices yet to be made. Conversations had drifted through the hallway, fragments of words reaching my ears: evaluation, procedure, risk assessment. The shepherd's ears flicked with each sound, nostrils flaring as he inhaled faint traces of concern, and I could sense his subtle, patient, but unyielding awareness that the fragile equilibrium of our room could be tested. It was a lesson in vigilance, patience, and the quiet courage required to anticipate challenges that might never fully manifest. I knelt by the crib, observing, feeling the room's atmosphere settle around us like a soft, protective veil. The shepherd's body shifted imperceptibly with every minor motion of the baby, his eyes reflecting a deep, considered intelligence. There was no haste, no abrupt movement, only the deliberate care of a being fully aware of responsibility. He was no longer reacting solely to instinct or threat. He was making conscious decisions to safeguard life, to sustain trust, to preserve the sanctity of this fragile bubble against the unpredictable outside world. Minutes blurred into hours as sunlight softened to muted orange, shadows stretching long across the hospital floor. I found myself reflecting on his journey nights spent alone, the faint traces of fire and smoke that had marked his fur, the encounters with danger etched into scars and memories. Each trial had honed his capacity for endurance, his patience, and his understanding of the delicate balance between vigilance and care. Now every gesture he made was steeped in quiet wisdom, every micro-adjustment a reaffirmation of his role as guardian, every exhalation a reminder that calm could coexist with readiness. The baby's fingers twitched, brushing against the shepherd's coarse fur, and he responded with a soft exhale, his amber eyes glimmering with subtle warmth. In that moment, I felt the full resonance of their bond, a silent conversation that spanned experience, vulnerability, and trust. It was a dialogue rendered not in words but in touch, breath, gaze, and presence, and I, as a witness, understood that the quiet courage of the shepherd had become inseparable from the safety and comfort of the child, a living covenant that required neither recognition nor reward. As evening descended, the room darkened, lit only by the soft glow of a bedside lamp. The shepherd remained perfectly aligned with the crib, body relaxed but ready, every movement deliberate and precise. Outside, the rain continued to fall softly, casting a muted rhythm against the windows, a delicate accompaniment to the gentle rise and fall of breath in the room. The quiet outside mirrored the tension and calm within, reinforcing the fragile sanctity of the space we had created together. It was during this time, as the soft hours stretched onward, that the weight of choice became undeniable. There would be human decisions soon, judgments made about procedures, about custody, about care. And yet, the shepherd's presence transformed these abstract challenges into a visible, tangible reality. Vigilance, courage, and patient authority could create a bulwark strong enough to preserve trust and safety. It was a lesson in the quiet power of deliberate guardianship, in the subtle heroism that does not seek recognition, and in the profound ways that patience and care shape the world around us. The baby murmured softly in sleep, tiny features relaxed and serene. The shepherd responded instantly, nudging the blanket, aligning his body, exhaling gently. I realized that in this interplay of care, vigilance, and presence, a transformation had fully taken place. No longer merely a survivor of hardship, the shepherd had become a protector, a silent yet deliberate arbiter of safety, capable of reading the world with a keen understanding that transcended instinct. And in doing so, he had not only safeguarded the child, but reshaped the emotional fabric of the room, creating a sanctuary of trust, love, and quiet courage. The night deepened, shadows lengthening, the faint patter of rain softening to a whisper. I remained in the room, observing the subtle rhythms of protection and trust, the careful alignment of bodies, the gentle gestures of reassurance, and the unspoken conversation that bound them together. It was a quiet heroism, profound in its simplicity, yet transformative in impact. Here in deliberate presence, the shepherd and the child had forged a bond so deep, so patient, and so enduring that it could weather uncertainty, decision, and the unpredictable tides of the outside world. And as I sat, feeling the weight of their trust and the resonance of their bond, I understood that this was the culmination not only of survival, but of choice, patience, and deliberate courage. The shepherd had chosen to protect, to endure, to care not for reward, recognition, or glory, but because it was the right act, the essential act. In that choice, the story reached a quiet, profound turning point, setting the stage for the redemption and closure that would follow. Night had settled over the city, a slow descent into muted darkness, with rain softening against the hospital windows in steady, rhythmic taps. Inside the room, the air felt thick with the weight of all that had passed the trials, the uncertainty, the silent endurance that had defined the shepherd's journey. He remained at the crib's edge, body low but alert, eyes luminous amber pools reflecting the faint glow of the bedside lamp. Every muscle, every subtle movement, spoke of vigilance, patience, and a deliberate choice to protect a quiet courage born from hardship, yet tempered by newfound trust. The baby lay curled beneath a soft blanket, chest rising and falling in an unhurried rhythm. Tiny hands twitched occasionally, brushing against the shepherd's fur, eliciting subtle responses, a nudge, a shift, an adjustment of the blanket. Each action, though small, carried immense weight, a conversation of gestures that had grown over days of mutual presence and quiet observation. Trust had been earned, not given. Safety had been offered, not assumed. And in this space, The fragile life of a child and the guarded heart of a dog had formed a bond that transcended circumstance. I observed them with reverent quiet, tracing the faint arcs of movement, the gentle tilts of head, the barely perceptible shifts in posture. The shepherd was more than guardian now. He was a teacher of patience, a guide of trust, a living embodiment of the power of deliberate action. His past, etched in scars and memories of abandonment, had not been erased but transformed, shaping the depth and precision of his protection. He responded to subtle cues, anticipating the baby's needs before they became urgent, aligning his body with a practiced elegance that balanced readiness and tenderness. Time stretched slowly, the soft cadence of rain against the glass, the faint hum of hospital machinery, the quiet rhythm of breath all blended into a lullaby of vigilance and care. The shepherd's amber eyes flicked occasionally toward the corridor, nostrils quivering at the faintest scent, muscles tensing subtly in readiness. Yet despite this constant alertness, there was a calm, serene authority that radiated through every line of his body, every subtle shift, every deliberate gesture. He was not only present, he was fully aware, fully engaged, fully committed to the silent covenant of protection. In the stillness, I reflected on the shepherd's journey nights of solitude, hunger, and fear, interlaced with faint traces of fire and ash that marked his body and memory. Each trial had honed not just survival skills, but an acute awareness of danger, a deep capacity for patience, and a growing understanding of trust. And now that wisdom had converged into a singular purpose, the absolute unyielding guardianship of a fragile life. His vigilance was no longer reactive. It was intentional, conscious, and profound. The baby murmured softly in sleep, tiny features relaxed, a faint smile brushing across delicate lips. The shepherd shifted slightly, repositioning with gentle precision, resting his head lightly atop the crib's edge, amber eyes never leaving the child. In that silent exchange, I felt the full resonance of their bond, a dialogue without words, yet infinitely expressive. Each breath, each touch, each small adjustment carried with it a lesson in trust, endurance, and empathy. It was a covenant written in the language of presence, one that demanded awareness, patience, and deliberate care. Outside, the rain softened to a whisper, leaving the world beyond the window quiet, muted, reflective. The contrast between the bustling city and the sanctity of the room within highlighted the extraordinary intimacy of this bond. Here, amidst the soft lamplight, the subtle rhythm of breathing, and the gentle cadence of vigilance, the shepherd had transformed. From a creature defined by abandonment, fear, and survival, he had become a being of deliberate guardianship, embodying patience, courage, and the quiet power of redemption. The night deepened further, shadows stretching across the floor, interweaving with the soft golden light of the lamp. Every movement of the shepherd was deliberate, purposeful, and infused with quiet authority. He nudged a blanket here, shifted his body there, adjusted for warmth, and positioned himself with the precision of a protector whose instincts had been refined by experience and trust. There was no hurry, no dramatic gesture, only the slow, deliberate unfolding of care, patience, and commitment. As the hours wore on, a profound sense of calm settled over the room. The baby slept, utterly secure, while the shepherd maintained his watch with quiet dignity. I realized then that redemption was not a dramatic flourish. It was a sequence of deliberate acts, small and intentional, that together created safety, trust, and healing. Every nudge, every shift, every alignment of body and breath contributed to a narrative of endurance transformed into guardianship. And in this quiet hour, the shepherd's journey, once marked by loss, hardship, and solitude, had reached its fulfillment. I sat back, letting the weight of the moment envelop me. In the interplay of shadow and lamplight, in the subtle rhythm of breath and movement, in the quiet gestures that conveyed more than words ever could, I understood the essence of what had unfolded. The shepherd had chosen deliberately, patiently, and courageously to protect, to care, and to form a bond that could not be broken by circumstance. And in return, the child had offered trust in its purest, most complete form, a reflection of innocence and resilience that illuminated the profound capacity for connection and redemption inherent in both human and animal hearts. The first pale light of dawn crept softly into the room, brushing the edges of the crib and illuminating the shepherd's amber eyes as he rested his head lightly atop the mattress rail. The rain had ceased entirely, leaving the world washed and renewed. The baby stirred once more, a soft stretch and a sigh curling briefly into the shepherd's fur, as if acknowledging the profound safety and love surrounding him. In that simple, fleeting gesture, the story of endurance, trust, and redemption found its quiet closure. Here in this room, in the soft light of early morning, the shepherd and the baby had found not only protection, but a profound affirmation of connection, patience, and the quiet courage of deliberate guardianship. Every scar, every hardship, every night of uncertainty had led to this moment, a slow, cinematic culmination of trust, love, and redemption, rendered not in words, but in the deliberate, measured, and unwavering presence of a dog who had endured, learned, and finally fulfilled his purpose.